Hi.
Are you exhausted?
And Dr. Cajun James is here. And if anyone knows about timber and forest companies or timber companies, you probably know of Sierra Pacific Industries. And so she's the lead scientist, but she also influences a lot of the different private timber companies. And she was instrumental in getting us funding to do more industrial lands. And then also to do some nice separate studies on the impacts of fires in her properties, which is like half of the California, I think, right? So anyway, and then helping her is Morgan Hannaford, and that name, well, he works at some little school up in Shasta. But he was one of Vince Rush's students, came from Berkeley, and decided to play music and live out in the wilderness. But unfortunately, his house burnt down in this last fire. So it is a sad note, but he's smiling. So anyway, the two of them are going to do the presentation.
That Morgan was my TA. I took several classes from Don Arnott and Vince Rush while I was at UC Berkeley. And Morgan and I were cohorts in our PhD program. So it's kind of cool to see how things come back around 25 years later. And for all you students in the room, you should definitely try to figure out who your classmates are, because you may know them for a very long time. These kind of things are important to come to. So first of all, as Jim mentioned, this is the Sierra Pacific Industries land base. 1.7 million acres in the state of California, and we have a lot of sawmills, we produce windows, we're a vertically integrated company. We're in both Washington and California. And in the year 2000, I was hired to start the research and monitoring department there. And when we were going through discussions, I really said I wanted to be able to do long-term water quality monitoring and surface erosion monitoring. And so the whole purpose of this department is to study forest management operations and forest salvage operations, and to see how those impact aquatic resources, sedimentation, habitats. What is the impact of these forest management operations on those important environmental resources. We have, since I've been there, we have long-term water quality monitoring. We have 24 sites out, and we also have 92 weather stations out. And these networks are really important because they allow baseline data to be available over the long term for a lot of these parameters that are really important to try to understand what recovery would be post-fire. And in the study we're going to be talking about today, we took that long-term monitoring data and we paired it with bioassessment data, so macroinvertebrates, algae, and then the PHAB data that's done. So this is a pretty collaborative partner project. So here's everybody. There's a bunch of people in the room. We've got Morgan, we've got Jim, we've got Marco, we've got Daniel Pickard, and we've got Rosalina, who's done the algae. And we have Beverly Van Buren from Moss Landing, who's done all the all the quality assurance work. So there's our QAPP, and a lot of people have talked about standardization. I think it's really important. I've always gotten peer review for all my projects, but starting about 5 years ago, we started with this program with Moss Landing, and so everything, we have a quality assurance plan. Everything is swamp comparable. It's the EPA 24-point plan. And Beverly's group at Moss Landing performs the third-party audits. So I'm going to walk around because I'm a Jack Russell at heart. And this is my work environment. Especially over the last 15 years, we've had a lot of high severity, large extent natural disasters, which are forest fires. So up here in the top right, what you can see is that's a water quality station that was burned over in the Ponderosa fire. And if you guys want to know what a fuel ladder is, here's a picture of one. So in the middle, you have a picture of Rock Creek, which was in the Ponderosa fire. And you can see there's a little tritium that sprouted after it. So this is the spring after the fire. So these are really devastating fires. And I've published some work on looking at different salvage treatments and which BMPs are better to keep the soil on the hill slope. But this really is where I've spent the last decade of my life. And when I made this slide, there was 380,000 acres that burned up in 3 fires, the Ponderosa, the Brim, and the King. And Sierra Pacific had close to 60,000 acres. So part of this was bumping into Jim Harrington again and Pete Odie and trying to decide, could we pair this long-term water quality data with doing some swamp sampling? And so that's what we've done. So on the left-hand side, you can see we're going to use the Greater Battle Creek as an example of this because there's a lot of data that's available in Seton that's comparable. So we're going to talk about that today. And if you look at this, the different Bailey Creek, Cannon Creek, and Upper Digger Creek, where those are in the middle of the watershed, that's Sierra Pacific Industries land. And in the Ponderosa fire, we had 18,000 acres burned. And that's out of about 28,000 acres for the total fire. And those round blue dots are continuous water quality stations. And up here, what we have is Jim went out in the field with me, Harrington, and the swamp crew, and we picked out some sites on class 1 streams, perennial flowing headwater streams, that were above the fire, within the fire, and below the fire. So the idea was to try to use this to track recovery. So here's a picture of what one of those water quality stations looks like. It's got a YSI 6820 SON with turbidity, temperature, conductivity, and pH. We've got weirs, and we also have pressure transducers, and it collects 15-minute data. And then we also have a network. This is a portable weather station, but in the fire area, we had 6 weather stations that were up and deployed during the fire, and we kept those up after the fire. So one of the things we can do with this long-term water quality data is we can look at changes in different water quality parameters and try to answer the question, what is the response in the stream, in the turbidity, to this large, high-severity forest fire. So there's 2 different locations on the graph here. The one in dark is from Digger Creek. It's right above where the fire was. And Rock Creek was within the fire. And I got lucky as a scientist because I had pre-fire data. So, and I want to point out, because I think it is important, each one of those bars is 35,000 turbidity records. So what you can see here is you can see that before the fire, it's like less than 4 NTU. There was a difference between the 2 streams. But it took about 3 years. The turbidity kept rising. And then in 2016, it went down. And then 2017, we had a really high water year. Am I in trouble? Okay. Jim would set me straight, right? We had a high fire. So here's just one quick example of what you can do with water quality data, because thank you, Jim. Whoop. Okay. Oh, not really. I don't know what I did.
Now you're in trouble.
Now I'm in trouble. Tommy, help me. Well, we'll just stand here. So I can see it. I mean, it disappeared. Don't give me that. Yeah, that's what I thought of. Never mind. Okay. So we want to go back once. Let's see if I can do that. Nope, I'm going forward. Okay. So it's really interesting here. So we can say, and I've seen this both in the Rim Fire and in the King Fire, which is up near Georgetown, where we have increases, significant increases up to 18. So the way I took this is I took the hourly average turbidity for 24 hours in a day, averaged them, and this is the average for 365 days. And you can see it went from about 3 NTU up to about 17.5 NTU, and then it goes back down. So we can say in the turbidity, we saw about a 3-year increase. And then it goes down. So that's good to know, right? We're getting recovery after these really high intensity fires. Then we have turbidity measurements where I take and make suspended sediment concentrations. So I have ISCAs in there. And one of the questions that I really had was, what proportion of that turbidity is inorganic versus organic? And so on average, I just put this up here to let you know that about in the fire areas, about 40% is organic material. And of course, that percentage decreases when you have more or inorganic material in it. So with the higher turbidities, that goes down. But so this is a really interesting question to me. Where is this coming from? Because you would assume in many ways they would just burn up. Yeah. Okay, so here's the water temperature. And so once again, the dark one is Digger Creek, which is really close to where the fire was. And the clear one is Rock Creek. And you can see it goes up for 3 years and then starts to decline. And that's pretty good. So not only in the water temperature, but in the turbidity temperature, you can see it takes about 3 years post-fire, and then you start getting it returning. So now Morgan, my TA, is going to come up here and give this portion of the talk.
Yeah, we're going to do a quick tag team here because we work with laboratories data. And to give the short brief history situation is in '94, I was at this meeting as a wide ag grad student. So it was good to see this conference 25 years later going good. What we're looking at here, of course, when you see something like a devastating wildfire in a forested area, and you have an ambient monitoring program going on, or maybe even a targeted monitoring like we had in this case, is you hope that your indicators of what you're using to monitor is going to show a response. When you're looking out there, you see it's obviously burned, and you're seeing, what do the organisms and what does the habitat show in response to that. Let me get my little, make sure I get the right button here. Anyway, so what we're looking at is this North Fork, Digger Creek, and Rock Creek, and we basically have an upstream site, and then this is the Digger Creek. This is Digger Creek within the burned area, and this is Rock Creek within the burned area. These are two confluent streams. And then after the confluence, basically Rock Creek together. So you can kind of get the idea that the middle two clusters are the burned area, upstream and downstream, kind of like the classic idea of an upstream, downstream study. Anyway, we're looking here at 2014, of course. This was 2 years post-fire. One of the things that initiated sampling on these sites was these wildfires, and the question of does ambient monitoring, is it a useful tool for measuring changes in forest habitat? And what's interesting here, as you can see in the post-fire recovery situation, is the burned areas definitely had a marked decrease. This is the CSCI score, the invertebrate response metric that's used. Of course, a measure of one, as you may understand from these conferences, or today at least, a measure of one is essentially you're getting the organisms that you expect. The observed organisms that you have there are what you expect to see at the location. So in the range around 1, 9.95 or down to 0.9, you're looking at likely intact or possibly intact, or possibly impaired or likely impaired would be down in the 0.8 range or so. Anyway, you can see a pretty obvious trend down, almost like a diminishing invertebrate response score following the fire in the burned areas. And so that's really interesting. It's good to see that we can see that there is a organism response measurable by what you observe in the habitat. Jumping forward to the habitat, of course, when the swamp crew takes the samples, a very thorough habitat assessment is usually done, and are always done, in fact, with the swamp protocol. And what you can see in these cases is the same sites in the same year range, and the burned areas are the two middle clusters, is that the habitat in these cases, the upstream site and downstream site, remains relatively stable, maybe even has a little bit of a marked improvement. But the burned areas, especially this Rock Creek area, which is pretty severely burned, had kind of a measured, marked step-up improvement in habitat. So the nice thing here is that, well, we have habitat recovery. We have organisms that are still maybe impacted by disturbance that occurred, the fire. And it's of course this relationship between habitat and invertebrates that we're really, or organism response that we're really quite interested in. So this was just one site that was collected among 3 different wildfires, of course. This was the Ponderosa fire. There's also the Rim fire and the Delta fire, which occurred down in the Sierra Nevada
at a range. So when you want to look at maybe all of Sierra Pacific land's response of, invertebrates biotic scores, the CSCI score, which is on the y-axis here, compared to the physical habitat score, you'd think, well, maybe would better physical habitat result in essentially a higher indicator of environmental quality with the invertebrates. We have a little cluster here that there's clearly not a true correlation going on here. But what we're looking at here, just to kind of point this out before we go to the next slide, is that we have samples that kind of range from this, checking the glasses here, kind of in the upper 20% to the 1.0 score mark, basically, observed over expected ratio. So these forest sites, I'm trying to get at, is these are up in higher elevation. They tend to be very, very good habitat and good water quality sites. When compared to kind of statewide data, what we're looking at, that organism response does seem to have a correlation with habitat quality. This is kind of a rough approximation of where those previous samples were taken. We're looking at fairly good habitat and fairly good water quality and organism response, basically. Even though when looking past the riparian zone, you can see the area had been obliterated by a wildfire. So real quick, I want to go through some of the ideas of, well, obviously, the organisms respond. What kinds of organisms are we seeing, or what type of response from organisms are we seeing? This is kind of the charismatic macroinvertebrate part of the talk here. Anyway, so we have, this is the above site, and one key feature that we can look at that seemed to be really useful or a good signal of change was the percent composition. It's one component of measured diversity. If you have the top 5 species, for example, if they're about even in representation, then you potentially have a site with a fairly high diversity index level. So you can see upstream that each bar here represents the top ranking in abundance species that are located in the site. And we have some collector-gatherers, and we kind of the classic examples of collector-gatherers, caddisflies, and almond beetle type. But anyway, the main thing to note here is throughout the 4-year sampling range, we had pretty much an even relative abundance of these top 5 species. So that probably contributed to the fairly high biotic scores there. When you go down to the burn site, for example, at Digger Creek, what you can see is you begin to see after the burn, it dominated by one top dog species. In this case, it would be a collector-gatherer midge that also tends to score relatively low in terms of its biotic index, indicating poor habitat or water quality. So this is kind of the trend that we saw post-fire, was not necessarily that we had indicators of poor water quality per se, but we just kind of had it dominated by individual organisms. My presumption is that they can survive fairly well in disturbed habitat. Further, if we go down, skipping ahead a little bit, we can look at the Rock Creek burn site, which had a more severe burn, and you can see that it was a different character here. This is a beetle rather than a midge, as we had in the previous site. But here we have, in this case, upwards of 60% of the sample post-fire dominated by this one species. So that's what's kind of loading these samples to indicate that there is water quality problems. Okay, so finally, downstream, we see this response that we dominated by a single species. But as we heard in earlier talks, a lot of the species that are considered to be fairly sensitive, like mayflies and caddisflies, can be members of this. This is a much more open site, maybe also impacted by grazing as well as the fire. So anyway, that's just a little snippet of the macroinvertebrate part. I'm going to pass it back over to Cajun to discuss how the surrounding swamp data fits into that.
Okay, Jim, give us a couple more minutes. I'll go fast. So here's one of the really important things about standardizing data sets. So what you're seeing here is this is the Greater Battle Creek watershed. There's 2 data sets that are on this graph. And what you want to look at is the round ones, the ones that SPI paid for, that were swamp data sets that were collected. And the bottom one was sponsored by the State Water Board in a grant to the Battle Creek Watershed Conservancy. So this will give, and these are all data points that were collected in 2017. So this gives us a good snapshot of what the conditions are of the waters in that year. There's a couple of points up above on Bailey Creek that were taken in 2015. So what you can see is overall, a lot of it's likely intact. But you can see above, we have a couple of points that are possibly altered. Within the fire, we still have one point that's likely altered. And then down below, we have some that are possibly altered too. So these are the CSCI scores that were calculated by Dan Pickard for this data collection effort. So you can see there's real value in standardizing how you collect data. And this would be one push I would have since you're all here, is that whether it be a citizens monitoring group or a PhD or even a graduate student, we really need to work on standardizing and making sure that everything has some quality assurance plan so we can share data. So this is the same watershed with the PHAB, the IPI scores. And what you can see is that all of these are likely intact. So, by 2017, even though the fire occurred, this watershed was looking pretty good with the physical habitats, so there was good recovery. All this data is in CEDN, and I think that's a really important aspect of doing this kind of work, is making it available for others. And I put this up here because, the beat goes on, so they say. So again, this fire, we had close to 350,000 acres burned this summer with the Delta HERS and Carr fire, and we were able to get Marco and Billy out there to do some more sampling. So I'm going to move quick, but I want to take the last couple minutes and talk about best management practices in salvage logging. So from my perspective as someone that's interested in water quality, even though I work for a timber industry, the best thing I can do is work with the foresters is to keep, the soil on the hill slope. And one of the things that's been pretty different in the last decade is actually we're starting post-fire as close as we can get to the waterways as possible. And that's because one of the things I've really learned over the last 20 years is that we need to do those BMPs. We can't go into the waterways with the California Forest Practice Rules, but we want to implement as close as we can because proximity matters. So we want to get in there as soon as we can, and we need to do operations as soon as we can because most of these fires are occurring in August and September, and so we don't have much time to get our best management practices implemented before it starts raining. So here's a couple quick pictures. We have to get in and get access, so we have to make road improvements. We have to assess our road network. We can do lots of BMPs to reduce sediment delivery off our roads. On harvest units for salvage logging, the goal is to actually increase ground disturbance so that we can increase water infiltration, increase soil roughness, and decrease the hill slope length. So there's lots of examples of this. Here's one, we can slash pack, we can do mastication, we can do logging, we can do contour tilling. That's a picture of that. Contour tilling is an expensive practice, but through several studies I've done, it costs about $1,000 an acre, but it's a great BMP to keep, to limit hill slope erosion. Okay, so what's the approach post-fire? So I guess the most important thing I would say is we want to have an evidence-based systematic approach to implement these best management practices. And we need to really work together to figure out how to reduce hill slope sediment production and delivery to waterways. That's the #1 goal. And we really want to be looking at BMPs that can be performed, post-fire to protect the aquatic resources and water supplies. And I guess the main thing I want to point out here is that, this was a collaboration between, there's probably 15 or 20 people in this room that have worked on this. A big shout out to all the field folks that are in the room that worked on this. It takes a lot of work. But by collaborating, we're really starting to break the code on, how long does it take these waterways to recover? Do they recover? What's the extent of the recovery? And we need to be able to do that in collaboration and be able to compare projects. By having that state water board grant that was already slated to go into an area that had burned, we're able to take, 9 data points and make it 31. And that's a huge benefit to the swamp program. The other thing that I've really learned over the last 15 years is that we can take post-fire information and apply it in non-fire situations. And communication is really key with all of this. Someone that's worked in the timber industry, you've really got to develop relationships with folks to get those BMPs done in a timely fashion, and a willingness to pay for that. And the last thing I want to say is, several of the people have said, we really need long-term data sets because those help us track and monitor recovery. And if we don't have those long-term data sets, it makes it very hard to have a picture of what's truly happening. We're done.